All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 191, I think. Somewhere in there. Today, we need to talk about the monk. Yeah. You know how I've been saying that quite a few different places, I have been avoiding any details about the the 2024 D&D 5th edition update that the Player's Handbook comes out beginning of September. I'm doing that for a number of reasons. One, I want to go into that book with as fresh of eyes as I can. And two, there is so much information that's coming out right now that I would go mad trying to keep track of all of it. That being said, one of the things Wizards of the Coast have been doing is they have been releasing videos for every class and subclass in the new Player's Handbook. And I haven't watched any of them until today, because they put one out on the monk, and anyone that's been watching this channel for more than like 5 minutes knows I love monks. Monks are my favorite class in any RPG ever. I love them. I think they're super fun. I am currently, my Elden Ring DLC build is using a new class of weapon they introduced called martial arts, because it lets me be a monk. And there's even a new item in there that lets you turn into a dragon man thing. And so for a couple of the bosses, I have been a dragon monk. And I just love everything about monks. And the reason I started D&D Deep Dive, which was the predecessor to Essential Essence to 20, was because so many people had such a hard time figuring out how to play the monk for a number of reasons. One, most people look at the monk and think, oh, it can do lots of attacks. That means it does the most damage ever, and it should be able to damage everything, and damage. Monk has never been a damage dealing class. That's not what it's designed to do. Even earlier editions of the monk were never designed to be powerhouses. However, especially in 3rd edition, there were versions of the monks and builds of the monk that could do crazy amounts of damage, and people thought that because you could munchkin the monk into a massively powerful damage dealing class, that's what the monk is supposed to do. And it's not. It is a controller type class. It always has been. And the 5th edition monk was actually a really good controller. I've said this many times before. The first character I played in the D&D Adventurers League was a shadow monk named Aether. Because I was a DM at the time, DMs had this thing where when you ran games, you could use the games that you ran to basically create higher level characters, where you could build a character and you could start at level 5 or level 7. If you ran enough games, you could start a character in the D&D Adventure League at tier 3. It took a lot of games to get that high, but getting a character that started at level 5 was not difficult, especially with all the DMing that I did for the Adventurers League. So I started Aether at 5th level. He was a shadow monk. If you search around this channel long enough, I even had a backstory, because I created Aether originally when I first started watching Critical Role. I'm like, well, what kind of character would I want to play if I joined the Critical Role campaign? And so I have this intro hidden on this channel that was made basically in the same style as the intros for... Sorry, I got something on my screen that's annoying me. In the same style as the original intros for the Vox Machina characters, which I think for the most part don't exist on the internet anymore because they kind of used copywritten images. I got in trouble for that. But Played that character from 5th level all the way up to 17th level, which is remarkably difficult to do in the D&D Adventurers League, because especially nowadays, they basically require you to start a brand new character every season. So I loved my Monk Aether, but the amount of damage that he did, generally I didn't care. There were a lot of situations where I would do 4 attacks in a turn and I would forget to roll damage for them. And the DM would go, how much damage is that? And I'm like, oh yeah, this does damage. Because doing damage was a secondary property to everything that I was doing. I had so many other things that I was focusing on that it just didn't matter. So one of my biggest fears about the revision that they're doing is they're going to take all the people that just don't understand and don't want to take the time to learn how to play the monk and change it into just a damage dealing powerhouse, which I think would really reduce the monk to something that was just boring to play. And so I watched the video, and I'm going to go over everything they talked about in there. So if you don't want to be spoiled for what the new monk is going to be, feel free to skip this video. But I literally, I do not take notes. There's something in my brain that taking notes causes me extreme amounts of anxiety. I have no idea why. It's probably related to something about me relating it to school and how much I vehemently despise school. But yeah, so despite the fact that it gives me unbelievably amounts of high amounts of anxiety, I took notes, and I have a whole page of notes about stuff that I wanted to talk about. And again, this is just based on the interview that talked about the features. I've not seen any of the features, so it's very possible that Jeremy Crawford's choice of words were not quite the right descriptions. But I know Jeremy Crawford. Not know him personally, though I think I might have met him once. But I know his work. And so I don't think my interpretations of it are that much off. So without any further ado, let's talk about the new monk. So the first thing that Crawford says in this video is that the monk is basically a brand new class, which I find incredibly disingenuous based on what he talked about here, because it's not a new class, it's just an improved class, but it's still going to play very, very similar to the original monk. It's not like the action economy and the things that you do in your turn are going to be massively different with the new monk compared to the old monk. No, you just have a few more options. And they stopped using the word key, because that's the worst thing that you could possibly do, is use the word key. So first things first, this is still the same monk. They've just changed a few things to make it, for lack of a better term, better. The first big change, the martial arts is the ability that you get at first level that basically gives you all your monk abilities. It improves your unarmed strike. It defines what monk weapons are. And it also gives you the ability to make an unarmed strike as a bonus action when you take the attack action. The new version of the monk changes this. The martial arts die, which is what makes your unarmed strikes and monk weapon strikes more powerful than other people's, has changed. Instead of starting at a D4 and I think eventually going up to a D10 was the highest it went to, it starts at a D6 and eventually moves to a D12. So the monk overall just got a damage boost. Which again, a lot of people will think that means, yes, monk is damage dealer now. It's still not. It really isn't. I'm sorry. It's not a damage dealer. But now it doesn't feel like the damage is useless. So that's nice. In addition to that, if you remember before, I mentioned that they can make a bonus, they can use your bonus action to make an unarmed strike if they take the attack action, which basically meant one of the most useful features about that martial arts feature required you to take the attack action, which is not that big a deal because there really weren't a lot of other actions the monk was taking. Just in general, they generally weren't doing anything else. with with their action, they generally were still attacking most of the time. Now, it no longer requires you to take the attack action. You can just, anytime you have a bonus action, you can use an unarmed strike, which is nice. However, they also changed what an unarmed strike is for everybody, not just monks. And this is one of the things where I kind of wish this change had been reserved to monks. But overall, I think this is a positive change. They kind of hinted at it in one of the playtest packets, but now this is the actual change. Unarmed strike, when you hit with an unarmed strike, you can do one of three things. You can do damage, which is what the martial arts die is for. You can grapple them, or you can shove them. Now, the way that the shove action works in current D&D, which before I say the wrong thing, I'm actually going to look it up. Sources, Player's Handbook, and I want actions in combat. Attacks, designated dodge, help, hide, ready, search, choose an object. Range attacks, melee attacks, opportunity, grappling. Shoving a creature. So, shoving a creature used to be a special melee attack. So it wasn't an unarmed strike, it was just a special melee attack. And you could shove it, and that would either let you push it 5 feet away from you or knock it prone. When Crawford was talking about damage grapple, the unarmed strike now can either damage, it can either grapple or shove. And it used to be both grapple and shove were a contested check. Basically, you would roll a strength athletics check, and the enemy could roll either strength athletics or dexterity acrobatics, and whoever rolled higher won. And that basically meant monks could not grapple and could not shove. Because monks already needed both dexterity and wisdom relatively high, and they generally needed a pretty decent constitution as well in order to be able to survive, because they were melee and they weren't wearing armor. So I don't think I ever saw a monk with a strength higher than 12. And you just basically generally didn't use athletics very much, and so you really couldn't make a grapple monk. Now, instead of having it a contested check, as far as I can tell, if you hit, you can just choose to grapple or you can choose to shove them. No save or no contested check involved. He does mention that there are saves for grapple and shove, so it's possible that if you hit, you force them to make a save. But the DC for that save, exclusive to monks, uses dex instead of strength. So you can now make grapple monks, which is a really, really big deal from a controller perspective. Again, this monk is not a damage dealer. They're a controller that is no longer useless at damage. And this damage grapple shove thing for unarmed strikes is a big deal, because at first level, when they get these abilities, they can already make 2 attacks per turn. They can make a single unarmed strike or an attack as their action, and then their bonus action, they can make an unarmed strike. Both of those can be used to do damage, to grapple, or to shove a creature, because that's how unarmed strike works. So because all of these are declared unarmed strikes, and that's what you can do with an unarmed strike, that means every turn a monk can, from level 1, move another target at least 10 feet. Now, they don't mention anything about knocking prone. All Crawford mentioned was moving them around. So it's possible they are splitting the shove action into a shove and a trip. Because if a monk can use an unarmed strike to trip someone, that is massively useful. And here's the reason why. At least according to original 5th edition rules, the way that standing up after being knocked prone works is you have to use half of your speed to stand up. If you are grappled, the grapple condition simply means you have 0 speed. So if you are prone and are grappled, you cannot stand up. And if you're on the ground, any melee attacks against you have advantage, and any attacks you make have disadvantage. So having a monk, if the shove action still allows them to trip, a monk in a single turn, especially once you get up to like 5th level, where you have extra attack, plus you also can do flurry of blows if you want to burn a key point, you can knock someone prone, grapple them, and still get 2 advantaged attacks, and there's nothing they can do until they break the grapple. And generally, breaking a grapple, at least how it is now, requires your action. So, from an action economy controller, this is really, really huge. Because the whole point of action economy control is, in most tabletop RPGs, whichever side has more actions, more things that they can do, generally has some sort of an advantage in combat. Now, different RPGs treat this a little bit differently. In 5th edition, the action economy by far was the #1 decider of which side had the advantage in combat. So finding ways to either take away actions from enemies or make their actions less useful was monumental. And that's what the monk did the best. It could do this better. Everyone thinks of Stunning Strike as the thing that they do and is very, very effective. We'll talk about how they changed it here in a second. But things like Patient Defense was absolutely fantastic as an action economy controller, because what it meant is any attack against you had disadvantage. And even at low levels, when you have a low AC for the monk, because you just don't have very high dex and wisdom, the enemies don't have really good attack modifiers. So there's a very good chance if they're rolling with disadvantage, they're probably going to fail. And that means that the attacks that they make are basically just evaporated into the action economy. They don't exist because they haven't done anything useful. And so that's a really, really great way to control the action economy, is simply running into an area, using Patient Defense, and watching them waste attacks against you. Later on, when you got things like deflect missiles, you could catch arrows and basically take away actions from the enemies, to the point where you could also throw them back, and that's the old version. We'll talk about the new version in a second here. So those are action economy controllers. Very, very useful. And now that Unarmed Strike allows you to grapple and shove, this can be a really powerful action economy controller. Because if shove still allows you to trip them and knock them prone, then if you shove and then grapple them, they are stuck there, granting advantage to every melee attack against them until they stand up, and having disadvantage on every attack that they make until they can break your grapple, which now looks like it's going to be a save against a dex-based DC instead of it being a contested check that monks were almost always going to lose. That's a really, really big deal. And it means that the monk can be even more tactical than it was. Again, if you wanted to play a monk well in 5th edition, you needed to treat them tactically. You needed to sit there going, okay, is my best choice here to use my bonus action to make another attack, maybe get an additional stunning strike off, or just do some additional damage, force another concentration check, things like that? Or is it better for me to use Patient Defense and get the dodge? Or do I want to use Step of the Wind and just get away so that they aren't able to attack me and I can come back in later? It's a very tactical class. This is going to increase the number of choices you can make from a tactical perspective without really increasing the complexity that much. It's just giving you a couple more tools that are going to be useful in a lot of different situations. And again, being able, again, I don't know if this is going to be how it works, but if they do allow this, being able to trip and grapple in the same turn is really, really useful. But it can be just as useful to use the hypermobility of the monk to use their 4 attacks, if you're also using Flurry of Blows, to just move someone 20 feet. Or to move multiple targets 5 or 10 feet, depending on how many you do. Like, that's a really big deal, because you can set them up for combos with other players. You can throw them off cliffs. You can use it to bottleneck an entrance so that the only thing that they can do is deal with your heavily armored paladin with a big old shield, who's just using their dodge action over and over again to make him basically invincible. Those are all things that can be used if you understand the tactics of being able to move people around. So that in and of itself, I was happy to hear. Again, it means that my monk is not just turning into me go punch thing. There's still action economy and controllers. When you get up to level 2, this is all level 1 stuff, guys. You get up to level 2, it's no longer called key, because key is racist. It's not, but that's what everyone's decided, and that makes it true. They call it Monk's Focus now, which I really didn't care about key. So I really don't care that they're calling them focus points instead of key points. The only kind of downgrade is focus has 2 syllables, while key had only 1. So it takes a split second longer to say. Oh boy. But it also changes a few other things. Normally when you got key, you had 3 different things you could spend key on. Flurry of Blows, Patient Defense, Step of the Wind. All of those required key. And that was one of the biggest limitations of the monk, is they were heavily key focused. Basically anything that made a monk cool, aside from punching things, required key. And if you ran out of key, your monk was useless. What they've done is Flurry of Blows, Patient Defense, and Step of the Wind now have, well, Step of the Wind and Patient Defense now have aspects that don't require key points to use. You just, for being a monk, you get to use them. And then if you use key points, they get better. Flurry of Blows hasn't changed. They basically just treat Flurry of Blows as an upgrade to the regular monk on Arm Strike. And it also means, again, it used to be Flurry of Blows required an attack action to use. So if you didn't use the attack action for whatever reason, you could not Flurry of Blows. Since they've taken that away, it just means that anytime you have a bonus action available and a focus point available, you can just throw off 2 unarmed strikes, which again, you could just use to grapple, to shove and grapple someone, so that you knock them down, grapple them, and then they just stay there until your allies wail on them. As a bonus action, Patient Defense, you can take the disengage action as a bonus action without using any points. It used to be Patient Defense was burn a key point and you can take the dodge action as a bonus action. Now it's you can disengage without using anything, but if you burn a focus point, you can also dodge. So not only can you disengage, which means you don't provoke opportunity attacks, you can also dodge at the same time, which means all attacks against you have disadvantage, which is nice. You can do 2 things at once. For Step of the Wind, you can just dash as a bonus action without points. But if you burn a focus point, you can disengage as part of Step of the Wind, and your jump distance is doubled. Now, jumping in base 5th edition is just about worthless. I'm hoping that they're going to be changing the rules for jump to make it actually useful, especially since now Step of the Wind doubles your jump distance. So that could be very cool. Now, the thing about this is monks can now disengage as a bonus action and dash as a bonus action, which, if anyone has been paying attention, is cunning action. Like, monks have effectively just been given the rogue's cunning action. And I have not looked through anything on the rogue. I hope that means that they have changed how cunning action works, because that was one of the defining features of the rogue, was their cunning action. And now monks get their cunning action, but better, because they can burn focus points to do better stuff with it. So I'm going to assume they did something to the rogue's cunning action. but I'm not going to be upset that monks can do more cool stuff that effectively makes them very much hypermobile, which has always been a thing with the monk. So, yeah. A new feature that you get at second level is called Uncanny Metabolism, and it's basically when you roll initiative, you can choose to get all of your focus points back and restore some hit points, but you can only do that once per day. One thing they didn't talk about, or at least I didn't catch, is they didn't talk about how you get focus points back. Currently, key points come back on a short or a long rest. So monks were very short rest dependent. They needed short rests in order to be able to use all of their abilities. If it's still regained on a short rest, and you now have this daily ability that allows you to just get all your focus back once a day, that means the monk is no longer hamstrung if you can't take short rests for whatever reason, or if your DM is just not allowing short rests for whatever reason. Without short rests, the monk becomes useless after like a fight or two. With short rests, you can go through an entire adventuring day and still do cool stuff. Because there were a lot of times when monks would use key points outside of combat to do things that were important. So Uncanny Metabolism I find really, really interesting, and I hope that means that they're just making it easier for monks to be able to get their key points back, instead of going, well, yeah, now you only get your focus points back on a long rest, but once a day you can just get them back. That would make it significantly less useful for the monk, because in general you could have anywhere between 2 or 3 short rests per day. So if now we're reducing it to it only gets it on a long rest, but once a day you can get it without a long rest, that's basically reducing the total amount of focus points that monks can use in the day. So that would be a massive nerf to a class that's already really heavily reliant on focus points. So again, they didn't talk about it in there, so it's possible that they didn't change that because they put a huge emphasis on the things that changed because they didn't mention it. I'm going to assume that it hasn't changed. If it has, I'm going to be mad. The next thing that they changed at third level, used to be third level, you got your subclass choice, and you also got Deflect Missile, which is a thing that has been a monk thing since I think either second edition or first edition. I can't remember where it first showed up. But it's basically, if somebody shoots an arrow at a monk, they can catch it in the air. And it actually was a really good ability for, as I said before, for action economy control. Because you only had to use it if it hit you. So you were never wasting it. And the way that it works, and the way that it still works, you'd roll a d10, add your dex mod, and half your monk level. Or no, and your monk level, not half, but and your full monk level. And reduce the damage taken by it by that much. If it reduced it to 0, you could burn a key point to throw it back. Now, Deflect Attack works this way. If the attack deals bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, you can reduce it by 10, plus your dex mod, plus monk's level, and you can redirect the attack at an enemy. And instead of making an attack roll for it, they have to make a saving throw. And if they fail, you do martial arts die damage as, I think it's force damage. So any attack now can not only be deflected, but also redirected. He didn't specifically say anything about using key points or focus points to do this. Again, the deflect arrows deflection part wouldn't cost key points before, but to make the attack, you'd have to burn a key point. He didn't say anything about using focus points for this, so it's possible that deflect attack you can just make the attack and not have to burn focus points, which I think would be very, very useful, because it still relies on your reaction, which you only get one of those per round. So it's still already pretty limited. I don't think it also needs the caveat of we're also going to make you burn your key points, because again, we've talked before about the idea of what's it called? Opportunity cost, which is basically if I do this, that means I can't do this other thing. And the opportunity cost on that deflect arrow attack was generally never good, because it was always better for you to use that key point either to flurry of blows or to stunning strike. Like, there was never a situation where the best use or even a good use of that was to make kind of a not really that useful attack once as a reaction. It just wasn't great. The big benefit of deflect arrows was the fact that you could stop the enemy from doing damage to their attack, which again was an action economy controller. Basically made that action completely worthless. It would be the same as if that action had never happened. So at level 13, deflect attacks gets improved to deflect energy, and you can deflect any type of damage and redirect any type of damage. So that is a huge thing, because there was always questions about the things like, well, what about a firebolt? You know, that's a ranged attack. Can they catch a firebolt? It's fire, and how would they throw that back? It would always turn into this argument at the table. And deflect attack just gets rid of that. Does it do bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage? They can deflect it. And then at 13, does it do damage? They can deflect it and redirect it. So that in and of itself, very, very cool, very, very interesting. Again, makes the monk a lot more fun to play, a lot more tactical, because again, you have, since you only get one reaction per round, you really need to think, what is my best use of this reaction? Do I want to deflect this firebolt that just kind of got cast at me, or do I want to wait until the dude with the massive greatsword that comes in and does like 40 damage with an attack, do I want to try and deflect that attack instead and see how much damage I can reduce it by, instead of just deflecting this little mini attack and then having a chance to turn that into my own attack? You know, again, lots of different situations. Both of those options are going to be viable. So, yeah. At level 10, they get a thing called self-restoration. Monks in 5th edition, I think at like level 7 or 8, became immune to poison, which meant they couldn't take poison damage, and you couldn't give them the poison condition or the diseased condition as well. And that was a little bit broken, because things like a green dragon, their breath attack is a poison breath attack. It meant monks were immune to green dragon breath. They just didn't do anything. Now, they have this thing called self-restoration, which if you're charmed, frightened, or poisoned at the end of your turn, you can just end it. No action required, doesn't take your reaction or bonus action or anything. Just at the end of the turn, if you're charmed, frightened, or poisoned, you just aren't anymore. You can just decide, you know what, I'm not. Which to me is a lot better. The earlier version of that, you could end the charmed or frightened condition by using your action on your turn. Was still very useful, but it wasn't great. This is significantly better. It doesn't require an action, so it's outside the action economy. And it's great. He also mentioned a thing called Heightened Focus, which improved your flurry, patient defense, and step of the wind. He didn't say, or at least I don't remember him saying exactly what those improvements were. But apparently you do eventually improve your flurry, patience, and step of the wind. So that's interesting. And that's another thing that I think 5th edition class design didn't quite get right until they started releasing things like Tasha's and Xanathar's. Was the idea that your defining features of the class should get upgraded as you level up. There were some defining features that just never saw any upgrade and became mostly useless because of that at high levels. They talked about the changes to Stunning Strike, and the exact notes I have in here are Stunning Strike, nerfed because people are dumb. Again, I cannot tell you how many dungeon masters would either outlaw monks entirely or would outlaw Stunning Strike because it was broken and it broke the game. It wasn't broken, it didn't break the game. It was just dungeon masters that didn't understand how to create interesting combat If all of your combat is, let's see who can reduce the other team's hit points to 0 faster, then yes, Stunning Strike is unbelievably broken. But if you create more interesting combat encounters, Stunning Strike is useful in a lot of situations, not useful in every single one of them. It still was one of the most powerful abilities that the monk had, and it was definitely core to their controller kit. Now it's changed. It's only once per turn, and fails still means stun. So it still works the same way as before. It's just you can only do it once per turn instead of 4 times per turn. However, if they succeed on it, that was the other thing that made Stunning Strike so not the broken thing that everyone claimed it was. If you had someone with a high Constitution save, Stunning Strike was useless. Like, giants in general were impossible to stun. And that meant a monk fighting giants was at a huge disadvantage, because while giants are not immune to the stun condition, they would have Constitution saving throws of like plus 12 or plus 15. And it just wasn't possible for them to fail. And when you failed a Stunning Strike chance, that key point just disappeared. It was, again, went into the ether. It was a wasted effort. And it always felt bad. Now, if they succeed on their saving throw, their speed is halved, and the next attack against them has advantage. So no matter what, Stunning Strike is going to have a beneficial effect for your team. The stun effect is better, but having their speed and making the next attack against them have advantage is still very useful, especially, again, if you use Stunning Strike before you're done with your attacks, because that means you could be giving yourself an advantage on an attack roll, or it could mean that when your Stunning Strike fails, you go, you know what? I'm not going to continue attacking this person because I want the paladin to attack, or I want the rogue to attack, and that advantage is going to give them much more benefit than me doing a little bit of extra damage on them is. So yeah, I understand why they made it once per turn, because yeah, it could get... I had one combat encounter that we did where we had 4, I think there was 4 beholder statues that just came to life, and because I had a weapon of warning, I had advantage on initiative, so I went first in initiative because I'm also a high dex character, and I basically, using flurry of blows and stunning strikes, I burnt 5 ki a round, or 5 ki a turn, but I stun locked all 4 of those beholder statues for 3 rounds. They did not... All of the enemies on their side did not get a turn until round 4, after which we'd killed, I think, 3 of them, because they would just fail their saves on it, and I just went boom, 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 over and over and over again. So in that aspect, a single character being able to completely take the other side out of combat for 3 turns, that is broken. So I kind of understand that. But, yeah. And then the last thing they talked about was every class gets an epic boon at 19th level. I hate epic boons. They were really, really dumb in the playtest. They're just additional feats. They're just additional feats that are boring. Hopefully, epic boons in the revised version, they took all the feedback that they got and actually turned them into something that's useful. But I'm not a big fan of... It used to be you would get a capstone ability at level 20, which I think with epic boons at 19th level, I think that means that if you make a 20 monk that is only a monk and gets all the way to 20th level, it sounds like they're going to get a capstone ability. And capstone abilities in 5th edition were really just varied wildly. Some capstone abilities were amazing, and some were completely worthless. If I remember correctly, the monk's capstone ability was if you roll initiative and you don't have any key points, you get 4 key points. Which is nice, but it really didn't feel that great. especially since at that point you had 20 key points. So a lot of times it meant you really weren't using that ability until you were on your third or fourth combat of the day, and that just didn't happen very often. And that was if you couldn't get any short rests in that day. So I hope that means the capstone abilities not only are coming back, but are actually going to be useful. Because like Paladin capstone abilities, they got a transformation ability where they were transformed into something badass and do awesome shit. And monks just got extra key points that a lot of times they didn't need at that point unless they were an elemental monk. So after that, I'm going to take another drink. They talked about the 4 subclasses in there. And they started with the Way of Mercy, or the Warrior of Mercy. They're no longer called Way of. They're called Warriors of, which to me is stupid. The justification that Crawford gave for it is we want to have a familiar naming scheme for every subclass. And so now we're just calling all of the monks subclasses Warrior of. Well, they had a naming scheme. It was Way of before. It doesn't really change anything. Way of Mercy versus Warrior of Mercy doesn't change much. And the Warrior of Mercy, the features of it doesn't change. If you've seen the Mercy Monk in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, it's basically the same thing. It just works with the new monk. So, yeah. The Mercy Monk is a cool class. It's one of my favorite monk subclasses because it's just it creates a very unique and interesting monk. Then they started talking to the other ones, which are the Open Hand Monk, the Elements Monk, and the Shadow Monk. I'll talk about them in the order that they talked about them. The first one they talked about was the Elements Monk, which we saw a preview of in one of the playtest packets. Basically, the current Way of the 4 Elements Monk sucks. Sucks massively. The reason why, what the attempt for the Way of the 4 Elements Monk was they wanted to emulate basically Avatar: The Last Airbender. They wanted a character that could use martial arts to also control the elements. The mechanical way they did that is they created a spellcasting monk, and for the most part, the only way you could do any elemental anythings was to use your key points to cast spells or cast spell-like abilities. And they all cost an ungodly high amount of key points, and they were never very useful, because 9 times out of 10 the monk would get access to spells like 4 or 5 levels behind full spellcasters, meaning, and they were damaging spells, so they were underpowered as soon as you got them and were too expensive for you to be able to cast them. And they almost all required you to use your action, which meant that you couldn't do the rest of your monk stuff, like your stunning strike and stuff like that. Also, you couldn't use your bonus action to do anything, because so much of your bonus action stuff required you to take the attack action or spend key points, which you already had just spent all of your key points casting Burning Hands. And it just really sucked. The new Elemental Monk is actually that. They're a monk that can do elemental shit. They have an ability called Elemental Attunement, which you activate with... They didn't say exactly how much, but they just... Crawford just said focus points. So I don't know if it's a single focus point and it lasts for a certain amount of time, or multiple focus points. My thought is it probably takes a single focus point to activate and then lasts for like a minute or 10 minutes or something like that. And effectively what it does is it increases the reach of your unarmed strikes. Now, remember what we already said about unarmed strikes. Unarmed strikes can do more than do damage now. And now you could increase the reach of them. So that changes things drastically. You can now grapple at range. You can trip at range. Anyone that's played Baldur's Gate 3 should understand just how devastating it is to be able to trip a target at range. Because one of the things that just about every really big combat encounter had was some dude standing a billion miles away with a crossbow and Battlemaster maneuvers where they would shoot you, and when they hit, they would also trip you. And it was so unbelievably powerful. And people had no idea that ranged Battlemasters, first of all, were a thing, and second of all, were crazy powerful. Unbelievably powerful. So the ability to move and possibly trip people at range is really useful. Now, the specific thing they said was 10 feet. So, again, it's probably going to be very similar to, I think it's called Fists of the Fire Snake or Fangs of the Fire Snake from the Elemental Monk, where you basically just burned a key point and your attacks, you could attack people from up to 10 feet away instead of 5 feet away, and it did fire damage. This one, he didn't say anything about it changing the damage type, but I think it probably would. But it allows you to just attack with reach effectively, which is very, very useful. And then it also, on hit, they can change the damage type. Oh, yeah. So that's what it was for elemental strikes, when you have this elemental attunement on, anytime you hit, you can just change the damage type to a bunch of different elemental damage types, which is nice. And you can force them to make a save, and on a fail, you can just move them. So remember, unarmed strikes can already move, but you have to not do damage in order to move. You can either do damage or shove. This allows you to do damage and shove. So again, from that controller aspect, you are, throwing, fire fists or water whips, or air blasts, and then also moving them around at the same time. So again, from a control perspective, that's a really cool ability. And being able to change damage types, in base 5th edition, changing damage types is a novelty. The only thing it's useful for is getting around resistances, because there are so few creatures that have weaknesses to any damage types that it's nearly useless. The only time it's good for anything is getting around damage resistances. That's all it's ever used for in 5th edition. I'm hoping in the revised 5th edition, or 5.5 is what I'm calling it, that they're going to start using elemental weaknesses more often. Because right now, it sucks that nothing is weak to anything. But still, that's pretty cool. At 6th level, elemental monks can take a magic action and use focus points. And this in particular, Crawford said focus points. So this will probably require multiple focus points. But you can make a 20-foot radius elemental explosion up to 120 feet away that does damage based on your martial arts die. And I'm assuming it's going to do multiple die, because a single die is probably not going to be that useful, especially since you're using your action to do it. I don't know, though. But this basically gives them, very similar to the Sun Soul Monk, where they had that ability to basically do a Kamehameha blast, and could do this kind of explosion thing somewhere. But it just really wasn't all that great, because the Sun Soul Monk in and of itself was just not designed very well. So basically very similar to that, but again, you can choose the damage die. And again, or not the damage die, the damage type. And again, because your additional attack is no longer tied to making the attack action, that means after you do that, you can still do a flurry of blows. You can still just do your free unarmed attack. If you have elemental attunement on at that point, you can make the explosion and then make a ranged or a reach attack with your elemental attack and move them all in the same turn. So yeah, that's interesting. At 11th level, when you have your elemental attunement on, you get a fly and a swim speed while it's on. So that makes monks even more cool. And then at 17th level, you get this thing called elemental epitome, which you get elemental resistance that you can change at the start of every turn. So just every turn, you just go, I'm going to be resistant to fire this turn. And your Step of the Wind increases your speed. If you use Step of the Wind, it increases your speed while you have Elemental Attunement on. And you cause damage when you move next to enemies while your Elemental Attunement is wrong. And you apparently get extra damage once per turn as well. Very similar to something like the Ranger, like the Horizon Walker or Stalker, whatever it's called, Ranger, where they can just add extra damage by kind of marking the target with their bonus action. So, yeah. Really, really cool. It makes it sound like the Elemental Monk is actually going to be fun to play compared to the current Way of the Four Elements Monk that just isn't fun. Because you're a monk that sometimes can do some elemental stuff, but in general, you're not going to be able to do anything. And it kind of feels like you're wasting your subclass, because other subclasses get a lot of cool stuff, and you get stuff that are so limited that most of them become daily abilities. So, yeah. Moving on. Shadow Monk, near and dear to my heart. My first 5th edition character is a Shadow Monk. I love my Aether. Shadow Monk gets a couple buffs that are really, really interesting. When you cast darkness, you can see in that darkness. That was one of the super cool, your DM doesn't want you to know about this build thing that people used to do in the first couple years of the Adventures League, is they would play a Shadow Monk, but they would take 2 levels of Warlock so they could get the Warlock thingy that I can't remember what they're called now. Eldritch Invocation, that gave them the ability to see in magical darkness. And so what they would do with that is, for people that don't know, the way that the darkness spell works is, unlike Silence, where you pick a point in space, and that's what Silence attaches itself to, is you just pick an area and it is silenced. The darkness spell, you actually pick an object to cast it on. Now, you can cast it on like the corner of a building or the ground or something. Those still count as objects. You can also cast it on like a pebble. And so what was a really common combo was these Warlock monks would cast darkness on a pebble, hold the pebble in one hand, because the way the darkness spell works is it continues to emit the darkness as long as it's not completely encased in something. So as long as just a little part of that pebble is not blocked by your hand, which is not difficult to do, you would have this field of darkness that would move with you, and no one, the enemies couldn't see you in it, but you could see them, and it was very, very useful. Now, effectively, you can do that without having to get 2 level dips into Warlock, which I'm not really upset about. It was kind of a weird thing, especially since the Shadow Sorcerer has the ability to see in their own darkness. So they could basically do the same thing without having to dip into Warlock, and a Shadow Monk who is built around Shadow, who requires Shadow for most of their abilities, just couldn't. So this, in and of itself, I'm perfectly fine with that. Shadow Step is the ability they get at 6th level, and it basically just lets you use a bonus action if you're in dim light or darkness to teleport up to 60 feet to another area you can see in dim light or darkness. At 11th level, you can burn a focus point so that you don't have to start or end in dim light or darkness, and you can make an unarmed strike as part of the same bonus action. That was one of the detriments of the Shadow Step, was if you use Shadow Step, you couldn't use, because it took your bonus action, you couldn't use your bonus action to get your unarmed strike or flurry of blows. The benefit of it was Shadow Step would give you advantage on the first attack after getting out of after Shadow Stepping. So there was benefits to it, and it was still a very, very useful ability. This just increases the usefulness so much, and it costs a single focus point, which I'm okay with. I think it's really, really cool. Being able to Shadow Step and attack as part of the same thing is really cool. Being able to Shadow Step when you're not in dim light or darkness is really, really useful. And then their 17th level ability, you get Cloak of Shadows. Basically, you turn invisible, and you become partially incorporeal. So you can move through enemies as if they're difficult terrain, and you move through solid objects as difficult terrain. And as long as Cloak of Shadows is on, you can use Flurry of Blows without spending focus points. So it costs focus points to turn on Cloak of Shadows, but once it's on, you have free flurries the entire time you're doing it, and you're invisible, and partially incorporeal. Like, all of that is really, really cool and fun. The last one they talked about was the Open Hand Monk, and this is one of the things where the ability to shove and grapple was actually something that used to be built into the Open Hand Monk. Whenever you took Flurry of Blows, any of the flurry attacks, so your 2 bonus action attacks, you could also either shove, trip, or grapple as part of that. And there was no save or anything, you just got to do it. And again, from a controller standpoint, it was very useful. Now it just happens because of unarmed strikes. They had to make some changes. One of the things they got was this thing called Wholeness of Body. It was a self-heal, which has always been something that monks have been able to do. But it sucked really, really bad because it didn't heal a whole lot, and you could only use it once per day. Now, and it took your action to do, so everything about it just sucked. And Open Hand Monks generally didn't use it in combat a whole lot. Now it's a bonus action, has multiple uses per day, which is nice. The other thing that's cool about the Open Hand Monk, they have this thing called Fleet Step, where anytime you take a bonus action to do anything other than Step of the Wind, you can just also use Step of the Wind. So, and again, Step of the Wind is 2 different things. You can dash as a bonus action without using points. Or, if you burn a focus point, you can also disengage and double your jump distance. So Step of the Wind means the Open Hand Monk, when he uses Flurry of Blows, can also dash. When he uses Patient Defense, can also dash. He always dashes. That is such a cool thing to create this just hyper mobile character. And then if you want to burn a key point, you can also disengage, or a focus point. You can also disengage no matter what you're doing. So you can use your just basic extra attack that you get, your bonus action attack, and then also dash. Neither of those costs you any focus points. Open Hand Monk is literally Open Hand Monk is literally hypermobile. They are faster than literally anything else in the game at this point. The other thing they changed was Quivering Palm. Quivering Palm, the way that it used to work is if you hit them and they failed you could use your action to activate the Quivering Palm anytime within like 7 days. When you did that, they had a save to make. They made the save. They took like 10d10 damage or something like that. Just an insane amount of damage. If they failed it, they insta-died. They were just dead. A failed save on that reduced you to 0 hit points. And that meant in really high-level stuff, Open Hand Monks were broken as hell. Because they could one-shot a Tarrasque. Because all it would take is find a way to exhaust their reserves of I choose to succeed. I can't remember what that's called right now. And then have them fail the save, and they instantly died. And if it didn't work, you could just try again over and over until you got the result that you want. They would eventually end up failing the save. And so, yeah, it was unbelievably. So now, according to Crawford, the revised Quivering Palm deals, quote, a truckload of damage, end quote, on a fail, and a smaller truckload of damage on a save, but it's no longer an insta-kill. Which, again, I'm not really upset about that. Quivering Palm was broken. But because it was an ability that you didn't get until like 16 or 17, nobody really complained about it because nobody played D&D at that level. So nobody really cared about that, except for a few people that played high level 5th edition. Which, if you believe D&D YouTube, is completely broken and unplayable. It's not, but stupid people go and say stupid stuff. So yeah, that is the new monk. Overall, I like where they're going with the monk, as according to Jeremy Crawford. Now again, all of this may be misleading. I haven't actually seen it. So it's possible that this is not nearly as useful as I think it is, and they're still doing the monk dirty. But from what I heard, from all the explanations that he made, and from what I know of kind of game design from Crawford, this seems like a phenomenally fun class to play if you like controllers. Now, I still think people are going to be upset with a monk because it still is not going to do as much damage as a fighter. Definitely not as much as a wizard or a druid or something like that. And people are going to be pissed. He's like, well, I can make 4 attacks at level 5 and yet I still can't outdamage this person. It's not fair. Just because it's not what the class is designed to do. I don't know how else to explain this to you. That's not what the class is for. But if you're willing to learn the class and get a good understanding of how playing a controller works, this sounds like such a fun class. Especially, like I said, I love the idea of a ranged or a reach, the elemental monk doing a grapple trip and then just staying back and pummeling this person with advantage with their ranged attacks, while that person is stuck on the floor and can't actually attack them. Like, I think that would be really, really cool and fun. The Elemental Monk sounds amazingly fun to play. The Shadow Monk sounds amazingly fun to play. The Mercy Monk is already fun to play. Try it out. It's super fun, and it already exists. And then the Open Hand Monk sounds amazingly fun to play. Like, all of these subclasses, the class itself, sound amazing. I'm super excited about it. I will probably, if I ever get a chance to play again, I will probably build a monk character in this new version if it does work the way that I want it to. Because it sounds like exactly, like this monk sounds like it was made for people like me. Which is exciting because so many other things, like, again, I've seen so many homebrews of, I've fixed the monk! And all it is, they now do 2d20 damage on a hit. And they can attack 72 times, and they add their dexterity modifier to their attack roll 14 times, and they can kill a Tarask by winking at it. And it's not what the monk's designed to do. When I did my class design thing where we talked about the monk, nothing in that is focused on I can do all the damage in the world. It's all about control and stuff like that. That's the class fantasy. And I think too many min-maxers are mad that they can't min-max the monk into a death machine. Anyway, it's going to be all for me today. I'll see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.